Okay, we are going to get started here in just one moment. Hello, and welcome to today's Seaside webinar, Taking Science to the Streets, Community Science and Participatory Approaches to Improve Environment, Health, and Quality of Life in Urban Areas. My name is April Wright, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Southeastern Atlantic region. The All of Us Research Program is an initiative by the National Institutes of Health asking for 1 million participants from diverse genetic backgrounds and environments to contribute their health information to a large biomedical data set to enable research on more precise, individualized medical treatments. Its mission to accelerate health research and medical breakthroughs, enabling individualized prevention, treatment, and care. Before we begin with today's guest speaker, there are a few administrative details I'd like to go over with you. Please feel free to use the chat and be sure to send it to all panelists and all attendees so that I, our guest presenter, and your colleagues can see your comments. If you have questions, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to submit a question. There will be a time at the end of the webinar to answer questions. Today's webinar is being captioned with live transcription. And you may adjust the size and appearance of the captioning by clicking the up arrow on the transcription icon. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks. Dr. Jelks is an assistant professor in the Environmental and Health Sciences program at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. She investigates urban environmental health disparities and the role that place, race, and social factors play in influencing health. She researches cumulative risk assessment, the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations, and the connection between urban watersheds, pollution, the built environment, and health. She also develops, implements, and evaluates community-based initiatives designed for low-income and communities of color to empower themselves to reduce exposure to environmental health hazards and improve quality of life. Please welcome Dr. Jelks. And I will stop sharing and leave it to you, Dr. Jelks.
Thank you so much, April. I will now attempt to share my screen. And thank you so much as I'm pulling that up. Thank you for the opportunity to share with your audience on today. Okay. Okay. So I'll just get right into it. I will share today some reflections from my work in Atlanta, Georgia on 3 community engaged research projects. So there'll be 3 brief examples that I'll go into after I give a brief orientation to community engaged research from my perspective. And then I'll talk about an ongoing water quality monitoring project that I'm involved with, a photo voice project that I worked on in the Proctor Creek watershed in Northwest Atlanta, as well as a participatory mapping project. And then I'll end with just some brief comments on implications for future research as well as practice. So as I begin my talk, I really want to talk a little bit about community engaged research. And there is a continuum. There's a big difference between research that is performed on populations or communities within a certain place and within those populations and communities and with populations and communities. And the bulk of what I'll talk about today is my work working with populations and communities. So not looking at those communities as communities or locations as places to study, not just doing work from within communities or studying phenomena happening in communities, but it's all about working with communities and with specific populations for whom we want to make some targeted improvements in health as well as environment and quality of life. So let me also just kind of share briefly information. This is kind of a sort of a comparison between what we consider to be traditional academic research and community research. There are differences in terms of the goal of the research. Traditionally, we think about science and we think about research as something that we do to advance generalizable knowledge. And while that is very important, from a community perspective, we also want to make sure that there is some betterment, to community or in a specific community. My research is very applied, so I'm concerned about, basic science research, but what I'm most concerned with is how we can apply that basic science to make some targeted changes in environmental conditions, particularly in urban areas, and how those conditions can then impact health and quality of life in a positive way. When we think about traditional research, the source of our questions may come from theories or theoretical work, as opposed to problems that might be identified from a community of interest. In terms of who designs the research, we're talking about a difference between the trained researcher designing the research alone versus the trained researcher working with community residents who have their own level of expertise to help design what the research looks like. The role of the research as we talk about these community engaged approaches, we're looking at community members as co-collaborators and co-learners with those trained researchers, and not a situation where you have the outside expert and then the research subjects. In terms of the role of the community, again, the community is seen as a collaborator, a co-learner, and not merely the subject of a particular study. When we think about the relationships between researchers and participants, in traditional research, the relationships might be short-term, very task-oriented, perhaps even detached. And when we talk about community research, we're talking about developing relationships for the long term. We're talking about multifaceted relationships and connections. In terms of the value of that research, in a traditional sense, we think a lot about publishing our scholarship, having it accepted, in peer-reviewed publications. And again, while that is a very positive thing from the perspective of community research, the real thing that community members are looking for are a contribution to community change. In terms of the data, traditionally the researchers own that data, but as we talk about communities being engaged in the research process, the communities have to have ownership of their own data. And finally, in terms of the dissemination of the research, again, traditionally we think about academic journals, we think about conferences. And in a community engaged research sense, we might think about those things, but we're also thinking about any other way that is palatable to that community, that's meaningful to the community to get that information out, whether we're talking about community meetings, different types of media, social media, print media, newsletters, infographics, you name it. However the community wants to receive that information is the approach that we often take in community engaged research approaches. So I want to center in a little bit of my talk on one particular type of community engaged research approach, and that is CBPR, or community-based participatory research. And this is research that equitably involves all partners in the research process and recognizes the unique strengths that each brings. CBR begins with a research topic of importance to the community, as I mentioned from the last slide, with this aim of combining that generalizable knowledge with action for social change to improve community health and to eliminate health disparities. Community CBPR, as well as I'll throw around a few other terms: community science, participatory mapping, even citizen science. These are a lot of these terms are used by a lot of different researchers. These approaches are increasingly being used by a number of researchers to address a number of things. When we think about citizen science, and I'll talk about what that is in just a minute, a lot of times we might think of a lot of ecological observations that are being made. But citizen science, especially citizen science that is driven by community interest and or what we call community science, is increasingly being used to address health issues and environmental justice issues in communities. Also, approaches around participatory mapping, using geographic information systems and putting that approach in the hands of community members to map things that are of importance to them, is also an approach that is being used increasingly more as we address a wide range of issues around health. But I've also seen it in the context of urban planning and as well as research around a lot of ecological observations as well. So since I brought up citizen science, what is that? And there are a number of different definitions that you might see for citizen science, and this is just one that I chose to highlight. Citizen science is scientific research that is conducted in part or in whole by amateur or non-professional scientists. Citizen science is sometimes called public participation in scientific research, and it's a partnership between public and professional scientists, very simply put. Community science is another term that I've already used. And one definition of community science that comes from the organization Public Lab is that it is a collaboratively led scientific investigation, exploration, and engagement in the entirety of the scientific process. So you can see how this links back to the definition of community-based participatory research that I've already shared with you in terms of, community members being involved at every level of the research process. And then one other term that I'll mention that I particularly like that comes from the work of Dr. Jason Corburn, who is he is an urban planner with training in public health, and he has written a book called Street Science several years ago, 2005, I think is the date that it was published. Street Science is a framework that joins local insights with professional scientific techniques with concurrent goals to improve scientific inquiry and environmental health policy and decision making. And so I broadly use community science in my work because the community members that I work with, that term resonates with them. But we could easily say that the work that we are pushing and trying to advance fits within this framework of street science. So the study area that I'll talk about today is the Proctor Creek watershed in Atlanta, Georgia. Proctor Creek is a 9-mile long creek that starts in downtown Atlanta and flows about 9 miles northwest until it reaches the Chattahoochee River, which is a river that is known is well known in our area because of the role it plays in providing drinking water to millions of Georgians. It's also a place where people recreate. It flows into the Apalachicola Bay in Florida, which has been touted as being one of the most productive estuaries in the Northern Hemisphere. And so Proctor Creek is significant for a number of reasons, in part because it's the only tributary to the Chattahoochee that is solely located in the city of Atlanta. And it has also been impacted by a number of environmental and stressors and hazards over the years. Historically, this has been a place where people have fished, swam, children have played, and people actually used to be baptized. So it has really been a source of pride for West Atlanta communities. Today, Proctor Creek is one of the most environmentally impaired creeks in metropolitan Atlanta, although we've seen a number of improvements to water quality in the creek in recent years, in part because of the work that citizens on the ground are doing to make it so. It is impacted by a number of pollution sources, including E. coli bacteria that comes in part from an antiquated combined sewer system that when we have heavy rainfall events in the city of Atlanta, there's the potential for there to be an overflow of raw, untreated sewage into this creek when we see those heavy rain events. And this is significant because the creek itself flows through front and backyards, school grounds, public parks, and other places where the community has access to it. This is a creek that should be able to be used for fishing, but it currently does not meet its designated use for fishing because of the pollution sources that impact it. And finally, in a couple of studies that have been conducted about the Atlanta metropolitan area, and specifically one study that focused on a 14 county metropolitan area in which environmental justice hotspots were identified. These were places where you had multiple pollution sources, but the communities in those areas had some level of social vulnerability, maybe low income communities, communities of color, and or language isolated communities. And for the Proctor Creek watershed, it ranked number 4 in the top 5 hotspots in this report, The Patterns of Pollution, a report on demographics and pollution in metropolitan Atlanta. So as I talk about the community engaged approaches that I and others are working on with Proctor Creek residents, and let me say this is a watershed that I have called home for a number of years and only recently moved a few miles away into the neighboring watershed. But for most of my 20 plus years in the Atlanta area, I've lived in the Proctor Creek watershed. So this has been as much about, working with fellow community members as it has been about me advancing advocacy to improve the very community that I live in. So there are 3 essential questions that Proctor Creek watershed residents have been concerned about over the last, decade or so. And I really could say longer than that. But when I think about the times that these questions came up in community meetings and discussions that helped to frame the research projects that I'm going to talk about, these were the questions. What pollution exists in the Proctor Creek watershed? What potential human health impacts are there from this contamination and pollution? And what actions can be taken or proposed to address these environmental and human health hazards in the watershed? I want to acknowledge that when we think about some of these questions, community members have talked quite a bit about challenges with the built environment. And what we know in terms of the impact that the built environment can have on health, that is sometimes difficult to gather sufficient empirical data to make convincing appeals for planning as well as policy decisions that will change what is happening with respect to the built environment in our communities. But this is just the type of thing that community residents in the Proctor Creek watershed have tried to address. So the first project that I want to briefly talk about is an ongoing water quality monitoring project that is called the Neighborhood Water Watch. This project this program was developed by a local nonprofit organization called the Chattahoochee River Keeper. Several years ago, they started to be approached by residents, not necessarily of the Proctor Creek watershed, but in other tributaries of the Chattahoochee River. And there were folks, quite honestly, on the north side of Atlanta, in communities that are more affluent than the Proctor Creek watershed, who wanted to get some assistance with getting their water quality tested. And so they went to the Chattahoochee River Keeper and asked if the River Keeper would test water samples from their local creeks and streams. And these were communities that were in the position to help assist with how those samples could be processed. And it kind of sparked something that made the River Keeper think about expanding this opportunity to the other tributaries in its watershed. And over time, what has happened is not only has the River Keeper expanded that project to other watersheds, but in places like the Proctor Creek watershed, through the work of some community-based organizations like the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, which is a partner in this project, the Riverkeeper now compensates community members from West Atlanta watershed, from the West Atlanta watersheds, including Proctor Creek, to bring in weekly or biweekly samples to the Riverkeeper's office and laboratory, and they are able to then process those samples and to help us get some understanding of what water quality is looking like in the watershed. And so whereas it started off as something that you had some folks who had the ability to assist with paying for the processing of the samples, now the Riverkeeper has grown its program in part through some collaborations with community-based groups, and they've been able to secure funding that has allowed this program to exist for several years now. And not only that, to value the time and expertise of those community members who collect these water samples, after being trained on how to properly do that, to bring in those samples on a weekly or every 2-week basis, so that we can have a better sense of the changes in water quality in this creek. And this has been really significant, I think, as we talk about this idea of street science, because we have trained, community members who are not, professional scientists, but they've been trained to, follow all of the right protocols to collect these water samples. And we're building a powerful database that is helping us to track the changes and the improvements, quite honestly, in water in Proctor Creek over time. One really significant finding or outcome of this work is the fact that because of some of the data that had been collected by community members, by members of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance as well, helped the city of Atlanta to identify that there were some problems around in a decommissioned, mini wastewater treatment plant. This plant had been decommissioned, but the water samples from this area were registering very high in terms of E. coli levels, off the charts, if you will. And while the city did not necessarily take this community data as the Bible, it got their attention enough so that the city could then invest its own resources into sampling and into putting closed caption TVs um, into the sewer system. And they actually found that there were some places in the sewer system where when multifamily, when people from a multifamily, complex were flushing their toilets, the waste was going directly into the creek because some of these pipes had not been tied off properly. So the city invested thousands of dollars, into investigating this problem and thousands more into the fix of that problem. But they were made aware of this first because of this community generated data that helped them to see that there were some problems and challenges that they had not even quite uncovered just yet. So that's the Neighborhood Water Watch program. And I could really talk the whole time about that program, but I wanted to just give you a snippet and to help you understand how community members are engaged in this work. Next, I'd like to talk briefly about something that has built, onto the Neighborhood Water Watch program and really come out of these communities discussions about what the environmental hazards are in the community, how those hazards may be impacting health and quality of life. And while the community has asked those questions of different professionals, the community also decided that that they had some responsibility to look inward to also try to come up with some of the answers to these questions. And by conducting a photo voice project, it gave us a perfect opportunity to not only take what community members had learned from others, but to elevate local community knowledge and lived experience to help answer some of these questions as well. So photo voice as an approach, and this is a participatory approach or methodology actually, that has 3 distinct goals. The first goal is to enable people to record and to reflect their community strengths and concerns. The second goal is to promote critical dialogue and knowledge about personal and community issues. through large and small group discussions of photographs. And the third goal is to reach policymakers. And so this really fit perfectly in terms of the community's approach to try to gather some of this compelling evidence that could move, decision makers, that could result in some particular changes, in the community within the Proctor Creek watershed based on the evidence that the community was able to gather and share. And so applying photo voice in particular to the Proctor Creek watershed helped to answer these questions. What are the environmental health issues facing watershed residents? What are the broader social and economic conditions that contribute to these health issues? How should we prioritize these health issues and socioeconomic issues? And what can we do to address them? What action can be taken as a result? Again, it's not enough to build on generalizable knowledge, but how can we take that generalizable knowledge and then push forward some sort of action, some sort of policy change or change in practice that can lead to real and specific benefits to the community. So in terms of our results, in fact, the next two projects that I'll talk about included the same group of 10 Proctor Creek watershed community researchers. These researchers were recruited from throughout the community. These were, adult members of the community, ages 18 or older. They just had to have lived in the watershed for at least a year. But what we found is that the participants had lived in the community from 8 to 66 years, and their ages ranged from about 30 to 66. And collectively, they represented about 325 years of lived experience in the watershed. And they also geographically came from 5 of the major areas of the watershed. In Atlanta, we have something called the neighborhood planning units, which are these umbrella kind of organizations that help us to, address a lot of local planning issues. And so generally you have multiple neighborhoods that are clustered into one MPU. And so out of 6 major MPUs that make up or comprise the Proctor Creek watershed, the community watershed researchers came from 5 of those. 70% of these participants were female, 80% of them were African American, and these were a mix of researchers, a mix of residents, some who had been previously active on issues around Proctor Creek and some who had not, but they were aware of the creek. They had some historical knowledge of the creek based on the time that they had lived in the community, and they all wanted to address issues around health, quality of life, and improvement of the environment with an emphasis, on the creek and the watershed itself. So through the process of Photo Voice, community members were tasked with the questions that were on the previous slide, and they were also tasked with thinking about not only community concerns, but what assets, are in the community as well. What is there to celebrate? What can we positively build on as we seek to try to address those challenges and negative things that we perceive to happen, in our community or watershed as well. And so there were 4 themes that came out of the work. Community residents took a number of photographs that helped to capture their thoughts about community issues. And each, we had about 1,500 photographs, altogether out of the 10 participants, and we went through a process of trying to, narrow each person's photographs down to their top 20, and then ultimately to a top 10. And then we worked on analyzing the themes out of the smaller sets of photos. Through that analysis, there were 4 general themes that came up that posited Proctor Creek both as a polluted eyesore, nuisance and toxic liability for residents, as well as a community asset and natural resource to be valued, to be protected, and to be restored. The themes include threats to the natural environment, built environment stressors that influence health, neglect and divestment of public resources, as well as hope for the future. It wasn't all about, the concerns, but it was also about a positive vision moving forward. So here briefly is a conceptual model that came out of the work, that came out of the analysis of the photographs, as well as small and large group discussions that we had about each of the photographs that the community watershed researchers took. In the end, we were looking specifically at, all of the things that lead to negative health outcomes as well as poor quality of life. And they included things from like divestments, in public infrastructure, in neighborhood infrastructure, in housing infrastructure, in the management of natural resources, um, in things like stormwater infrastructure, a lack of investment over time and actually neglect, of the infrastructure in the community. They also looked at things like lax code enforcement, inadequate public works infrastructure and services, things like illegal dumping that doesn't often go punished often enough, and as well as lack of effective and authentic engagement of community members in decision making. um, Lots of issues came up like gentrification and resident displacement, this idea that the investments are not made until the communities have suffered for a number of years, and when those investments are made, displacement is the next thing that happens. People don't necessarily get a chance to stay in place to enjoy those new benefits. And the work of these researchers, both in this context as well as in broader community organizing, is being, I guess, implemented to address these myriad of issues. So as we think about the ability of pictures to make a difference, and some people would say, oh, this is just a simple approach of using photographs just to document things that are happening in the community at one point in time. And while that is true, pictures really are a clear record of what problems exist in a community at a particular point in time, and we have been able to effectively use them to hold policymakers and others at the municipal level accountable. The photograph, as some say, is the undeniable static record of the truth. And so community residents, these watershed researchers, thought that it was important to have some way to document their community concerns. They were tired of going to community meetings with government officials, voicing their concerns verbally, and in some cases being ignored or marginalized. And so they thought that if we could have photographs, and not only photographs, but we'll also capture the GPS locations of these photographs so that they can be the problems and issues can be tracked to their sources if that is needed, as a part of remedying the problem. So they really felt that this was one way to begin to develop a community generated database of problems and issues that needed to be addressed in the community. So as we think about these themes, one, the threat to the natural environment, there was a strong connection to a sense of place and value placed on the creek itself for many of the reasons that I mentioned earlier about this historical pride that residents have had. There were also lots of concerns about sewage pollution, bacteria, chemicals, illegal dumping of tires, of trash, and other types of debris, including construction debris. In terms of built environment stressors, community residents were concerned um, about flooding, for instance, and how flooding of the creek. And you can see in this example, that here you have a home that is, or a couple of homes actually that are creekside, and so believe it or not, this creek, can spill over its banks, and it has done so, and many people have been impacted in their homes by flooding, and then by the associated mold and mildew and health impacts that come as a result of that. This flooding has displaced communities, and then communities have also lost. Or individual homeowners, in fact, have lost some of their property due to soil erosion, coming from these flooding events, as well as the scouring, of the banks that happens a lot of times, when there are heavy rain events, even if it's not a major flooding event. The theme around neglect and divestment of public resources was really all about the lack of investment in infrastructure, whether we're talking again about things like stormwater infrastructure that could help to alleviate some of the flooding that communities in the Proctor Creek watershed experience, as well as concern about blight, about inadequate code enforcement, inadequate or ineffective watershed management strategies to address the flooding, and concerns around gentrification and the displacement of in-place residents. Community residents also talked about the lack of meaningful community engagement, um, with respect to new development and planning efforts in the community, really wanting to push forward, the idea that any new development that happens in the community should be equitable, and that from a policy perspective, it's not enough to invite and to invite new developments into the community, and to make it easier for developers to invest in those communities without also putting in safeguards to make sure that people who have lived through the poverty and pollution, who've lived through the disinvestment, get a chance to stay in the communities to benefit in place from the benefits that are to come. So these were a part, these were strong themes, as a part, of this overall, idea of neglect and divestment of public resources. But really, all wasn't lost. While the community watershed researchers identified a number of challenges, a number of problems that they wanted to see addressed as a part of this research, they also acknowledged that they had hope, and have hope for the future, hopes for a playable, fishable, swimmable Proctor Creek. They lifted up the role that community residents are currently playing in this change process, and saw that as very positive. They saw that there is still life and vibrancy, value, and beauty in Proctor Creek, despite the fact that it is challenged and impacted by pollution in some areas. The creek is seen as a resilient natural asset for the community, a place that provides wildlife habitat and a legacy for future generations. And they strongly believe that citizen action, as well as government investments, and the investments of the private sector, can help to restore Proctor Creek to its former glory. And as one of the watershed researchers said, I learned to swim in that creek. I played in that creek. I fished in that creek. I just want it like it was. And so this is the sentiment of many of the watershed researchers, as well as residents of the watershed, who have this historical connection and remembrance of when the creek was a lot more vibrant than it is now. But again, I do want to assert that things are improving in part because of the action of these researchers and other community members who are working to make a difference. So the last project that I want to talk about in the last few minutes that I have left is a community mapping project, participatory mapping project. And so this was sort of a natural extension of the Photo Voice project. In Photo Voice, the residents were able to identify a number of sites, a number of challenges, come up with general themes that they wanted to take to decision makers, and indeed did take to decision makers to address issues in the community. But I mentioned earlier this piece about not only taking photographs, but being able to spatially locate where the problem issues were happening and occurring. And so, in terms of this project, we mapped what I like to call the hidden hazards of the community. This was a process that was co-developed by community members, by these watershed researchers, to prioritize meaningful street level neighborhood environmental health indicators that the community sees to impact environmental quality as well as quality of life. And through this participatory approach, we developed a citizen science app or application, using that we can use on phones and iPads, to collect data around significant environmental hazards and stressors in the Proctor Creek watershed that had not been captured by other data sets. When you look at a lot of the publicly available data for the Proctor Creek watershed, you might get different types of facilities that might be a part of something like the toxic release inventory. There might also be sites from, say, the Georgia hazardous site inventory. This is kind of a state Environmental Protection Division list of site concerning sites, as well as at the federal level, we could look at things like Superfund sites, and other sites that would be on the radar of agencies like EPA. But in terms of all of those data sets that exist, the community found that many of the stressors that they are concerned with on a daily basis were not showing up in those public data sets. And so again, the community felt that it was up to them, to get these types of sites, on the radars of decision makers. And to do that, that they would need to collect that data themselves. So not only did we collect photographs, in some cases we collected video if something warranted that, but we also collected the point locations that correspond to the neighborhood level environmental health indicators. And this really allowed residents to speak the language of decision makers and to prioritize the needed action that they felt was necessary to improve health and quality of life in the Proctor Creek watershed. The watershed researchers selected the following, indicators as their priorities in kind of our first phase of this project. So they wanted to identify locations where there's often standing water or where water pools, locations where there is dumping in Proctor Creek and its tributaries, both on the land or in the water itself, as well as locations where there is faulty stormwater infrastructure, where there might be clogged or collapsed storm drains, sinkholes, depressions, or other things that might be caused by inadequate drainage, excuse me. And so the idea here was that they had brought, or felt like they had brought, many of these concerns to municipal officials, but they, kept hearing, oh, we're not aware of flooding happening in the community. We haven't heard about flooding, for 10 years or so. And since this was an everyday occurrence for Proctor Creek watershed residents, especially, in heavy rain events, they wanted to, identify not only areas where things like flooding happens, but where there's illegal dumping and where there are opportunities to invest in the stormwater infrastructure to not only assist with some of the flooding events, but also just to kind of keep things operating, in a smooth manner on a daily basis in terms of smaller localized flooding events. This is kind of a collage of some of what we collected. You'll see a few images that are captured in our map. And so at the bottom, you'll see, a map that has, orange and green and purple. And so this is a map of some of our pilot data that shows the geolocations, excuse me, of where you see this illegal dumping, where you see the standing water, where you see the places where there is faulty stormwater infrastructure. And so through the application that we were able to co-develop with watershed researchers, if you were, looking at kind of a live interface with the tool, you could hover over any of these little colored boxes or triangles, and then see the photographs that align with that location. If there's a video, you could click and listen and watch the video. And you can also pull up data that was collected around, perhaps the type of illegal dumping, where the illegal dumping was happening. Was it on, private property? Is it in a public space? Is it on a sidewalk? Is it in the middle of a street? So those types of things you can pull up by looking at the map that is embedded into this application. And here are just a few other examples, just kind of blown up for you to see the standing water, the stormwater infrastructure problems, the illegal dumping both on land and in water. And finally, I'll just mention as I kind of close and get ready to turn it back over to April for the Q&A and for final announcements, is that what has been really, I think, gratifying by this work, and I will say that this is a work in progress, so it's not like we've, conducted these last two projects or even the ongoing neighborhood water watch program, and we can, we're not claiming, that this was, successful and now we can move on to something else. We have to continue this work. But I've already mentioned, some of the promising things that have come out of it. One other thing that was really great is that these community investigations led to action by our city's Department of Watershed Management. And I know that this slide is not, it's almost illegible, but this was a press release that the City of Atlanta's Department of Watershed Management, sent out about, how these community investigations led them to some sites, even on the City of Atlanta's property abutting Proctor Creek, that caused them to investigate illegal dumping and to clean up some major swaths of land that previously, I'll be honest with you, city officials denied that these sites existed. But when community residents and these watershed researchers sent their data to city officials, to the state Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the federal EPA, quickly the city got out there, they began their investigation, and they actually cleaned up a site that, initially, again, they didn't acknowledge that it existed. So this is part of the power of this community engaged research. I'll also just end in saying that this community engaged research really gives community residents ownership in the work happening in their communities. Unfortunately, even when some of this research happens, in communities with this idea or intention to benefit communities, it doesn't always include those communities directly. And so, through these various community engaged approaches, if we kind of lift up, community-based participatory research as one one piece of this continuum that is really a very um, promising practice, and for some it's kind of the gold standard, of research in terms of the engagement of academics along with communities. It helps the community members to empower themselves, to be more active, to have better venues in some cases, to push forward, to advance the action and change that they want to see happen in their communities. So I will stop there. Here's my contact information, and we can take some questions if there are any.
Dr. Jokes, thank you very much for that presentation. There are several questions. I'll start with the ones that are in the Q&A. Anthony Allen is asking, what prompts were given to participants in the Photo Voice project? And what questions help you narrow down to 10 photos each?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. So in terms of the Photo Voice project, we kept it really broad in terms of asking people questions about what environmental health issues did they perceive there to be in the community. What were the environmental health challenges? What were assets and strengths? So we didn't want to just, focus on kind of a deficit approach to looking at things, even though, we wanted to, in the end, look at changes that could happen, in a positive sense to make things better. We wanted to acknowledge that some of the community assets might be, effective in helping to effectuate that change. So the questions were really broad, just about those challenges as well as the assets, excuse me, that people saw with respect to environmental health issues, in the watershed. And so we left it, pretty much just that simple. And I may not be phrasing it exactly right, but it was pretty much that simple. And I can try to put in the chat. We did publish an article around that work, and so the specifics are there in the article in terms of the methodology section. In terms of the approach to helping us to kind of analyze those photos, Photo Voice includes something called the SHOWed approach. And I've worked with this so much that I probably will get the acronym wrong if I try to go through everything. But the questions are something like, so what's really happening here? How did this, kind of come to be? how can we educate the community about these issues? What action can we take, to address these issues? So there was this framework, this showed framework, and a worksheet that we actually used. And so we would run every picture through this showed, framework and answer specific questions relating to those photographs. And then we would have these large, we started with small group discussions and then larger group discussions to pull out some of the commonalities in terms of what people found. And so you can find the showed approach in literature about the photo voice methodology. One of the main articles is by Wang and Burris. I think the date of that article is 1987. I think if you Google that, you'll come up with the article that sort of first laid out photo voice as a participatory approach. But as I said, I'll maybe stop the screen share and I will engage with the chat and put the article link in there from our work specifically for anyone who'd like to see it.
Dr. Joke, someone was actually asking for your contact information as well. They wanted to see um, the slide with your contact information.
Okay, and I can put that
Okay,
in the chat as well.
thank you.
Are there other questions?
Yes, there are many other questions. um, okay, one, did you train the community members with any kind of photography skills?
So we did have an introductory session on how to take photographs, and we did a little bit of practicing. So um, we had some practicing sort of like in the classroom, and we actually went out into the field and kind of did a modified sort of windshield tour, if you will, of the watershed. Got out at different locations that were of interest to community residents, had them to take some photographs, and we did a little bit of critiquing, of those photographs. But more so than that, we tried to, get them used to this approach of talking about the photographs. We had an exercise called a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so before we got into the showed approach of how to actually analyze each photograph, we did this role playing so that they could just get their feet wet with the approach in general, and so that they would feel comfortable, and not only with taking their photographs, but in talking about them and talking about what those photos represented to them.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Are there similar projects within Metro Atlanta? The idea of community research and street science is wonderful to me.
There are other projects that are going on. Some are going on in terms of photo voice in particular, um, with in other neighborhoods and communities. Also, in the Proctor Creek watershed and in surrounding areas, we're getting involved in some projects that are looking at heat vulnerability as well, looking at some of the impacts to climate change that communities experience. And so we're actually gearing up to work on an initiative in which community residents, as well as students from Spelman College and Georgia Tech in particular, are going to be taking temperature data throughout Atlanta, but really focusing in on communities that we believe are most vulnerable to climate change impacts and to extreme heat. So that is a project that is, in the works and will be launched this spring. It's not dealing with the water per se, but dealing with climate change, resilience, and all of these things are kind of feeding into each other.
Okay. How can community groups make local colleges and universities of issues that could make great research projects?
Could you
How can
repeat that again?
how can community groups okay, but I think it's make use, how can community groups make use of colleges, local colleges and universities um, with issues that could make great research projects?
Yeah, I think when relationships can be built, there is a lot that can be done. with respect to, local community-based organizations, kind of making, use of this collaborative work with local, academic institutions. And so if there is that relationship building in place, if there can be some shared goals that can be met, then I think that the sky really is the limit in terms of, using the expertise or engaging with that expertise in colleges and universities and combining it with that community level expertise to, address specific policies, to try to, make specific changes, happen in communities. So I think it's unlimited, if there is, I think willingness and, if there is a, commitment to build those relationships, because it doesn't just happen, instantly per se. It's about building relationships, and that's more of a longer term process sometimes than some of the research projects we might, often think about.
One question says, what about communities that need this kind of help, but do not have research institutions in their community to initiate projects?
Well, that's a good question. So, obviously it's going to be easier when there are academic institutions in or nearby those communities. I have definitely seen, situations where, even when um, the folks are more remote from each other, that it can happen and does work. There is a program, and I'm going to get the name wrong probably. It's called the CUP program, um, that had been something that was working out of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. But the gentleman, Michael Burns, who was running that program, now has a nonprofit organization in which he is pairing up different academic institutions with community partners, and they are not always co-located in the same place. So, obviously, in terms of doing that work remotely, that might, bring in some challenges, but perhaps, opportunities as well. And so I think looking into initiatives like that, and I think April will send out the recording. Maybe I can pull up the exact resource that I'm speaking of to share that in case anybody is interested in looking at the work of that organization and just finding out how these matches can be made, even when the academic institutions and those community-based organizations are not in the same location.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jokes. We still have a ton of questions. So I am going to, is it okay if I send you some of the questions at a later, to maybe be answered in the email
Sure.
that I send out to participants? Okay, we'll do that. I will send questions to Dr. Jokes. And to get more so that you can get more answers to more of your questions here. um, there is one question that can be real quick, I think. I think I really like this CBPR concept. Would IRB requirements be the same for this type of research?
Good question. Yeah, IRB is going to be pretty much the same in terms of, kind of anything that you're doing in terms of human subjects research. So it would be the same, go through the same protocols. I did find just one little nuance on the photo voice piece that I'll mention, is that because, I wasn't limiting in our photo voice project what people could take pictures of, so they could, take pictures of people if they wanted to. And so that did require a little bit of additional work. I was able to get the IRB to not require that these community watershed researchers get their city training, but I had to develop a training for them that was sort of, city-like, that would help them to understand the process of informed consent. And so they had to consent individuals, and we went through role playing and all of that to make sure that they were comfortable and had the mechanics down. In the end, I found that people were were not as interested in taking pictures about people, but that was, you know, a little additional piece that we had to address in terms of, you know, the IRB process. And so that was something that had to be revised, and we had to develop this training. But that was able to keep the watershed researchers from having to go through the city training themselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jokes. This has been a great presentation. All right, everyone. Let's see, a recording. As a reminder, today's presentation was recorded and will be posted on the NNLM YouTube site, and I will share my screen once I can get to that. There we go. Okay, so it'll be shared on the NNLM YouTube site, and I'll send out the link to everyone who registered for this webinar. And the next webinar that the SEA region is hosting is Intersectionality in Health Disparities, focus on Black transgender women. And that will take place on Wednesday, March 31st at 2 p.m. And I am collecting, I am collecting the questions that were in the chat, and I will send them to, and in the rest of the ones that were in the Q&A box, and I will send those to Dr. Jokes to see if we can get those answered for you. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And at the end of the webinar, you will receive a link for an evaluation. Well, actually, yeah, it'll pop up. Please fill it out, especially if you want to receive the MLA credit for this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Jokes.
Thank you so much.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.